now that all the technical details are out of the way, we'll get started. For today's webinar, Increasing Student and Nonprofit Readiness for Community Campus Engagement Placements. And sometimes that community campus engagement is shortened to CCE. So if you hear that acronym, we'll try to maybe avoid using acronyms, so maybe just ask everybody to spell everything, all the acronyms out, but sometimes you might hear CCE, Community Campus Engagement. So we have two presenters with us today. I'll ask that they each take a moment to unmute themselves to introduce themselves to everybody. And they're going to touch on the preliminary thoughts, on the following question. And that is, how can we support student experiential learning while at the same time support our nonprofit community partner organizations and their readiness to support community campus engagement work? So maybe Lisa, we'll start with you. So if you could just unmute yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lisa Moore-Putland. I'm the Executive Director here at Volunteer Victoria. And Volunteer Victoria sits on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people. So to the Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wasanic nations, we say thank you. This is an amazing place to live, work, and volunteer, and also to encourage volunteerism and civic engagement and service learning for students and partnerships with post-secondary institutions. So today I'm here as an Executive Director of a volunteer centre, but I also sit on the board of Volunteer Canada and have been involved with the University of Victoria's community engaged learning processes for several years now. And it's interesting to see the development and the emergence of new types of learning, new types of partnership. So before I really get going into how we make things better, I'd just like to acknowledge that there is strength and tremendous capacity already within the systems, that there are phenomenal work has been done. Volunteerism and service learning has tremendous strength and value for students, for the institutions and faculty members, and for community. And when we look at what that means, there are multiple sides, multiple benefits. So one of the things that we look at, and volunteerism has been such a phenomenal strength in Canada. But since 2010, volunteerism has dropped statistically. But we know that youth are the strongest demographic of volunteers. So we know that new students, people coming out of high schools, entering universities, have a very strong concept of volunteerism. They also are more likely to have been coached, mentored, supported by their high school teachers and counselors. So they've had a very strong adult in a school-like system supporting their vision and value of volunteerism. When folks end up in post-secondary institutions, there is still a lot of support for that type of service delivery model through campus housing, residential life, informal volunteerism, through campus clubs. This is very, very strong. So we look at community engagement and say it exists in wonderful ways. Where it becomes a bit more nuanced is the switch between volunteerism and service learning and engaged learning, where there is a definitive outcome and learning outcomes, where the balance and the reciprocity has to be negotiated between the student, the institution, and the community group. And very often we see different types of engagement having different types of outcomes, recognizing that there isn't one solution to getting more people involved. When we look at this, we tend to sort of break down community engaged learning into three types of categories. The type of category where an instructor or facilitator says to a student, I'd like you to learn about community and community involvement, but it isn't part of a particular assignment. It is a general gain more knowledge. It is a general become stronger, connect with community. This is where there's some confusion between, I think, on the student end, between what is their volunteerism, which they've been very involved with. So students in their 20s already have 5-10 years worth of experience in volunteerism. They're coming with tremendous knowledge, and they're looking to use that knowledge. So very often, the students in a classroom already have relationships with community groups. They exist, but they don't exist at the university level. I think that's one way of expanding the base for faculty members who are already busy. It takes a long time to set up a relationship with a nonprofit organization. And so using existing relationships in the classroom are a really valid way of honoring the student and the work that's happened, but also building. But then we sort of move on to how do we create specific projects that generate more information and more knowledge and transfer that knowledge. And then how finally do we generate research and applied learning, applied practice. And a great example of this are faculties like maths and statistics, which say, well, you know, we actually never go to a nonprofit group and try to expand their research methodology, do large data problem solving with small nonprofits. So there's sort of a disconnect between what we get, what we need, and what has longitudinal impact for nonprofits. The other thing that we're interested in and we're seeing a lot of is the divide between rural and urban service. So in urban areas where there may be a small number of nonprofits serving a specific community group, it's harder to place large numbers of students. And we had a great example last year from Ontario of a faculty member that had been placing 80 students a year, and suddenly the local college had a similar program, and all of a sudden there were requests for 300 placements a year, all going to 3 or 4 organizations. So access, learning who is doing the type of work that you need, and how do we extend that beyond the well-known organizations to the organizations that are perhaps doing good, solid work but are less known? And that takes a great deal of time and investment in knowing the community. So there are some local resources, your local volunteer center, your local funding organizations will be able to connect you with more organizations. But also, I think, supporting the joy of volunteerism, joy of community engagement. We see many students, wonderful students, who perhaps have never experienced volunteerism in a school setting. And so some of the talk about having very experienced students, also the other side of that continuum is readying students who for whom volunteerism isn't a value or a cultural expectation. And we tend to forget that Canada has a very high sort of support of volunteerism. We are a nation that has a large number of nonprofit organizations, and volunteerism is a way of building employment history, of making connections, of building resumes. So we take it for granted that a student will understand what volunteerism is, and even in community engaged learning, that they will understand what it means.
Mm. Thank you so much. So we wanted to bring to you perspectives from the nonprofit and public sector. So thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing that perspective. We also wanted to bring perspectives the university and faculty, and so to that effect, we'll now invite Stephen Hill to join us and say a few words. And then after that, after Stephen speaks, since Kausar isn't there, unfortunately for the student perspective, we'll then be opening it up to questions to the group. So without further ado, Stephen Hill.
Okay, thanks Isabel, and thanks very much to for Lisa for those really thoughtful comments. I do have a couple of slides, and I'm going to try the technology to share them so people can see a little bit of context. I'm really honored to be part of this webinar and to tell you a little bit about some of the things that I've been thinking about with people from the CFICE group research project for the last few years. And in particular, just some context, I'm a faculty member at Trent University in the School of the Environment, and we facilitate student undergraduate community-based research projects with two brokers, ULinks in Haliburton and the Trent Community Research Centre here in Peterborough, the Peterborough region. And so on average each year, there might be 50 projects, 50 different projects with individual students or student groups that are brokered, and those projects are brought to us by the independent brokers from the community. So we think very much about how to make that a community first type of approach. In the first 3 years and 3.5 years of the CFICE research program, one of the things that we learned, or one of the that we learned together, was that students weren't always ready for this type of research, that they had been trained in academic learning and academic thinking and research, and so that was a shortcoming and that needed to be improved so that we could actually think about how to make the student experience beneficial to the community. So I have this theory that I encountered from the education world about student learning, and applied it to the idea of community-based research, which is obviously one form of campus community engagement. But the idea that a student is aware that they can do research that's beneficial to communities, that's driven by communities, they know it exists and it's relevant to their learning. And then they start to ask about it. So they might encounter it in high school in the first year, and they ask about it, and then they probe those questions in second and third year. And then they begin to try it and learn it in third year or fourth year, and then they realize that they can be an effective community-based practitioner in their fourth year and in their graduate work or in their post-grad studies and in their professional career. And so the things that we've been working on in CFICE were to look at curriculum mapping for community-based research. So the idea of tracing where students are exposed to the ideas within the curriculum, not just within a single course, so that they're ready to undertake some of these activities when they get to a fourth year and into their own professional careers. And then to build some of those components within the actual curriculum that could help it. And one of them is an online set of modules that introduce community-based research targeted towards second and third year students. And it's just hot off the presses, these online modules, so I'm excited about that. To create terms of reference for students that are undertaking graduate theses and honors thesis with community-based partners. We've worked with a high school program to think about how those students are exposed beyond volunteering, to know that they are actually doing service through their academic work for communities groups. And then also to think about our service learning program here and how it connects. So in our curriculum mapping, these were some of the skills that we saw for undergraduate students that were important. And many of them are common with other work integrated learning or type of experience. So whether it's professionalism, awareness of their own career path and their own competencies, being a good listener, being good at with interpersonal skills and communication, managing their time, managing the pressures of a project, and working in a team, working in a group. But then some key competencies in the middle that were particular to community-based research, one being the intercultural competence, the understanding of other types of people that are different from ourselves or from themselves, whether it be someone in a marginalized community or in a different context. Also just this idea of civic engagement, their willingness to actually engage in their community and with the people around them. Their knowledge of the actual community that they're working in, to know the context and understand the history, which is important when we look at the fact that university students and college students often go to communities that they didn't grow up in. So how do we help them learn about that place and understand it and understand the context? And then fourth, the research skills that are somewhat different than other academic skills that they need to know, because the research is normally about a real problem, something they want that a community partner wants solved. And that may not have the same kind of academic rigor that they're encouraged to think about with their own academic learning. So that's thanks, but I put this slide in particular to say thanks to some people that have been helping me. Jim Blake, who's the chair of the ULinks committee, Mistea To, who's a graduate student in sustainability studies here at Trent, and Kyle Mackey, who's been instrumental in helping us with the online modules. He's an instructional developer. So thank you, and I'll unshare that.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen. So just before we continue, Stephen, could you just spell out what CFICE is, just for our colleagues here?
So CFICE is Community First, the Impact of Community Engagement, which is the 7-year SSHRC research project that we've been part of, that Nicole and others has been part of, that has looked at campus community engagement and its impacts and benefits for communities. So Lisa mentioned the idea of placements going to rural hosts that aren't able to handle them all. And so we need to be thinking much more thoughtfully about how institutions of educational institutions are actually working with communities so that community benefits. Mm-hmm. Communities' priorities come first.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just wondering, before we get started, so both of you touched on this issue of knowledge building. You mentioned earlier, Lisa mentioned earlier, in terms of how can we turn this into longitudinal impacts, have applied learning, and Stephen, you talked about community-based research and transferring those skills. Just curious, how do you see the idea of engaging with graduate and doctoral level students on community-based research projects? There's been a lot of emphasis on undergraduate students. In Ontario, at least, some of the mandates we've received, they're spelled out as, every undergraduate student shall have a work integrated learning, experiential learning opportunity before they graduate. Just wondering if you could touch on some issues for graduate students. I'm not too sure who all here is in the webinar room today, but just to raise that question of engagement with graduate students too.
So I'll tackle that first, and if Lisa can add in. We found, and we find here that it's important for students to have undergraduate experience with thinking about community-based research and how they undertake that, because then it changes the nature of how they pursue a graduate research project or a graduate thesis, that they understand that it's going to be co-designed with a community partner, and that in effect the community partner becomes part of the student's supervisory committee. And so you have to negotiate a more complex terms of reference for those graduate students, and they need a additional skill set. You can't just be a good academic or good at school. You have to have those other skills of understanding the community and civic engagement and intercultural competence that enable you to actually be effective as a community-based researcher. So you can't, but you can't just assume because someone has good grades in their undergraduate degree, which is the primary requirement to go do graduate work, that they have those skills. And so we need to be carefully thinking about this within the curriculum, and to integrate it throughout the curriculum. It's not taught in a single course. So where do we have these moments, these touchstones that move the student from being aware that something exists to feeling confident that they can do it? Mm-hmm. Lisa mentioned that, and I if she can add in on this, but she mentioned that it can be really difficult you have to know something about the community partners, and that's hard for students to be aware that the relationship is often, it takes a long time to establish it.
Mm-hmm. And especially if you're going from, a small group to all of a sudden 300 students, right? As you were mentioning, Lisa, one of the projects that multiplied very quickly. Lisa, what about you?
Well, I really appreciate what Stephen has said. I also come to it from a slightly different angle, in that some faculties have done a really beautiful job of connecting the idea that graduate work and graduate research is also a connector to employability. And very often students don't think as the nonprofit sector as their immediate go-to place, that we will be able to have a strong, competent career in the nonprofit world, that there are complex things happening in the nonprofit sector, policy development, again, serving people. It isn't all about just being on the front line. So again, some of the academic questions that we have that we're like, oh, that's a great question. And we do need the research skills of graduate students and doctoral students because they're unique research questions. But we tend to see, I think, a fair number of master's students coming. We don't see very many doctoral students coming and saying, I'd like, this is my sector, this is my subsector, I'm going to do some research, I'm going to actually answer a question. We don't see a lot of that, I think.
Great. I'd now like to put it out to the people who are here with us today to type some questions. It helps if you could mention who the question is directed to. There's one particular speaker. And you could use the chat box as well. So, yeah, so you see Nicole's message there. And just while we're waiting for people to type in their questions, I know this is going to be probably on quite a few people's minds here, so just putting it out of the way. Stephen, you shared with us that great curriculum and the online modules for community-based research training for undergrads. How can people access it and apply it effectively?
Well, we have it as I'll share the beta modules so that people can see. I'll share the screen. I have it up. It's available. It will be available through the Trent Community Research Centre's website.
Great.
And they're open, Creative Commons licensing, open content. Anyone can mix and match them. It's a set of the modules. There's 9 modules that have curriculum around, what is community-based research, how do community needs drive that research, helping students understand the nature of negotiating partnerships, of research approaches in terms of working with community groups and data. The notion that data analysis, the rigor of data analysis is as much about how useful is the conclusion to the community partner as it is about its generalizability. The issues around power and privilege and ethics that come into play. And then some of these interpersonal issues of project management, working in groups, managing conflict, and so on, and communication. We have some stories about students themselves who have pursued community-based research projects, and so hearing community partners and hearing their voices. And each of these modules is essentially a short 3 to 5 minute video, or each of these units is a short video, and then some voices from the field, as we've called them. People talking about their own experiences. So they're on YouTube channels and they can be accessed that way. But it is available. This is the beta site, and it will be available through the Trent Community Research Centre. They're going to host it on their server. And so that's great. We're grateful to that. So it's something that's meant for students it's targeted at 2nd and 3rd year undergraduate students. But obviously there's anyone can use it.
Wonderful. Well, talk about real knowledge equity, knowledge sharing, and knowledge democracy in action. So I encourage everybody to go have a look. Speaking about experiences, so I'm not seeing the questions. I don't know if it's just people are typing away, or I'm not able to read them. But just while we're waiting for that, and speaking about experience, Lisa, you touched on it briefly about some of the challenges and opportunities that are faced by organizations such as Volunteer Victoria and Volunteer Canada, and the whole of the nonprofit sector in being flooded perhaps with increasing amounts of demands from not just, as you mentioned, it's not just the universities, it's also the K-12 schools that are encouraging volunteerism. So on one hand, it's great. We want to encourage this culture of volunteerism amongst Canadian young people. At the same time, you know, how do organizations have the capacity, build the capacity to do this? And how can we do it in a reciprocal, respectful way? Do you have any, can you share some of the experiences you've had and maybe some of the challenges, how you might have dealt with them?
Certainly. It's an interesting question. Recognizing that every relationship can take a different path moving forward. So one of the things that we think we should start with is a general understanding and an agreement around where the university sits. Is this an agreement between a student and an organization? Is it an agreement between the university, the student, and the nonprofit? Or is it an agreement between the nonprofit and the university? We would suggest that the best relationships are a triad where all three understand what's happening, why, what are the preferred outcomes, what are the goals, and if there's conflict, how do we resolve them? The challenge, I think, for many organizations is the disparity in timing. So a student in a 14-week undergraduate classes, 14 weeks sounds great. It's a long time. There's a lot of challenge. There's a lot going on. I have exams. I have life. How much time does 14 weeks actually translate into in terms of volunteering hours and service hours? So we recently had a university who decided that 15 hours was an appropriate amount of time. There's no judgment on that. But 15 hours isn't a lot of time for a nonprofit when it may take us 3 to 5 hours to onboard a volunteer. So, and we take that time with every volunteer. So when a university says you've got 15 hours, it actually, 50% of it is going to training and onboarding. So we want to be able to create spaces where there are realistic expectations. What can be done? What needs to be done? And sometimes those conversations are with students, sometimes they're with faculty members that are designing courses. And then also, I think it just takes much longer to design and to build the relationships. I know Stephen's wonderful work, that didn't happen in a year, right? You didn't get to 500 projects in a year or even 2 years. There were relationships that were built, and you figured out where the best organizations were for really great learning and for great experiences, and then how to problem solve together. But there are great tools out there, and I think it starts with just an understanding of working together and a commitment to working together and problem solving together.
Wonderful. So now we do have quite a lot of questions here. So just going to scroll up and take the first question, if everybody can read it. It's from Maeve Leiden. Hi, Maeve. She's writing from BC. So she asks, have any of you been doing any analysis and work with youth and students to connect well-being and mental health to place-based projects, curriculum, and real-life connections with community? Seems like a win-win with a crisis on Canadian campuses with the stress and anxiety and depression levels among youth. So I don't know if that's a question. I guess a question maybe for both.
My short answer is no, but it's a great question and a great it's provocative, right? Because I share Maeve's I think concern about this crisis. She puts it in quotation marks, but it doesn't need that. It's a crisis in terms of anxiety and well-being and in young people. And I do think that there's an important role in this to show meaning in the work that students can do and meaning in their learning. You know, this is the chance to actually, this work is the chance to make this world a better place. And we have the privilege and the responsibility to help students navigate that and find their place in it. And so, but I don't know, you know, that's just me speculating. Does that kind of empowerment help with some of these other things? And I don't know, but it's a powerful question. Thank you, Maeve.
I'd like to invite Lisa and anybody else actually in our webinar to respond to that question. But over to you, Lisa, first.
Yeah, again, it's a very complex question. There are certainly places where organizations prepare volunteers of all ages and stages of life, not just youth volunteers, but volunteerism as a form of wellness, where organizations are able to support that individual. The primary concern for organizations is that not all organizations have the capacity to do that. So the assumption that a nonprofit organization will be able to support a student through a journey, and especially when we have students who perhaps are experiencing, they're away from home, they're living in a different place, they're away from friends and family, that there are some underlying issues that then are easily dealt with connection and some good support and counseling. But the real complex issues come with who manages that. Is it the university and the counseling? Is it a faculty member? Is it an organization that reports a student? And the answer is there's no path forward. There's no definitive answers around who helps support and manage a student when they come. When we have a volunteer that's not connected to an institution, we can provide community-based supports. But when they're coming from the university, and remember, particularly when a university is placing a student, our first goal would be to turn that those supports back into the university environment and ask how the university wishes to manage those supports. But we do see a lot more volunteers, again, of all ages and staging of life, who come with complex issues to the workplace. You know, feelings of isolation, loss, worries about money, stress, homelessness, you know, language barriers, literacy barriers. So some organizations are really well versed and able to manage that. Some are not. Our big fear in this environment is that how do we support students so that they don't fail at community engaged learning? They don't fail a class, they don't drop out, they don't experience anxiety in the middle of an opportunity and then feel like they failed at it. That's our biggest fear, I think, is failing the students in this process.
And thank you. So I noticed there's some questions. I'm going to just skip to one that's a bit further down the line because it speaks to something that you've just said, Lisa. Afterwards, we're going to try to go in order, but I would invite you from now on. We have about 25 minutes left. You can unmute. You can type in your question if you prefer, or you could also unmute your microphone and ask directly so we can hear your voice, which is always nice. So one of the questions here. Sorry, my eyes are darting to the chat box here. So. The question that Roxanne Dupont has for Lisa about training and workshops, I think you've slightly addressed that one. We're going to go to Christina Stewart's question about issues of funding, but before that, Kanguli's question here about how conversations can be had with students who don't come from a culture of volunteerism or community engagement. That might speak to what you've just said, Lisa. She writes, often students self-select out of these opportunities because they do not make the immediate connection to the ways in which this engagement complements their academic studies and career path. So I'm wondering about, you spoke about how do we engage those that are with you? What can we do for students who are not, I guess, who are not in these opportunities? So I'll start with you, Lisa, and then turn it over to Stephen.
Yeah, I think, again, it's about accessibility. So where does the first conversation happen about the importance of volunteerism as a form of building knowledge and gaining employment skills and getting a context? And again, some faculty members have really good tools about this. For others, it's an awkward question. How do we feel about volunteerism can open up a can of worms. And we've had youth talk about volunteerism on a long line, a long continuum. Everything from it was empowering, it was engaging, I had insight, I motivated it, to it's a form of unpaid slavery. And when students tell us that, you need a safe space to unpack it. So a lot of the volunteer centers in local communities will have tools to help unpack what is volunteerism, what are volunteer rights. But the complication bit comes in when it's a mandated educational system where we're saying negotiate the hours, and then a faculty member says, no, you must do 100 hours. It's not negotiable. This is what you need to make a grade. So that's where it gets complicated. And I think one of the things is having a bit more education at the faculty and community level. Co-op programs are really good at this. A new faculty member who isn't supported by admin may not have those tools. So I think the online tools that Stephen have produced are brilliant around helping build capacity.
And speaking about faculty support and challenges, Stephen, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so, this question of students who don't come from a culture of volunteerism or community engagement, and it's not something they want to do. And, you can make students aware of these things. I think it's a challenge if students are required. If this is a mandatory part of their curriculum, it can be a challenge for them not to feel that it is, did not feel off. Some may feel that it's an unsuccessful or unwanted experience. I'm also sympathetic to this idea of the unpaid internship, right? That we need to think about students, the financial pressures they're under to complete these degrees, and so we do know that does privilege wealthier students, and so it's something to think about that. I guess my answer to the question about how do we have these conversations, I think the institutions themselves need to think and understand their role as good institutional citizens within their communities and within our society. Universities it's no longer enough just to create academic knowledge that's read by a small group of academics. We have to show the relevance for the work that we do. And that's role modeled in the ways and types of research and teaching that faculty and people at universities who, let's face it, this is a really incredibly privileged position in society to have these things. We need to role model that for our students so they see it the same way that I try to be a half decent role model for my own 3 kids. And so you want to do that. The institution needs, the culture within the university sector needs to show that being a community-minded, volunteer, civically engaged citizen is who we want to be. And that's by giving faculty, to opportunities to be serving communities, to helping support students to do this work. So I think it's the role modeling that shows that it's valued, and then let people come to it on their own.
Great.
Much as we can.
I want to come back to this notion. So there was a question about payment earlier, and I want to tie that to this, some of the language that we used earlier. Stephen, you mentioned work integrated learning, that there's some similarities between community engaged learning, work integrated learning. We've mentioned co-op. There's a question here about, from Christina Stewart, how students can be funded in nonprofit placements. My role hasn't dealt with this to date. So we know that co-ops are funded. There's work integrated learning, placement opportunities sometimes are funded. Perhaps a student in a nonprofit organization for a community engaged learning course, for example, that's usually unfunded. So question around how students can be funded in nonprofit placements. What are some thoughts about that? And maybe touching that on, I guess that relates also to some of the issues of access that some of you have raised earlier.
So if I can, if we could collectively solve this question today, we would be much honored and loved in community across Canada. This is a very complex question. Ironically, I think there's again a bit of a timing issue. Many organizations only have access to additional funding during summertime and summer student funding, when most institutions are not offering their learning schedules. So ironically, there's a bit of a disconnect. More funding would be available in summer, but that's not when when students are registering in those courses. There are some funding pots for students in specialized areas, students who perhaps have differing abilities or disabilities, some newcomer grants, but they're few and far between. They're not consistent. So one of the best areas is to really take a look and build a relationship with an organization that may use students as entry-level positions. But again, one of the challenges with that is that very often co-op placements, and I know here in Victoria, we see co-op placements with government. Those government positions are often paid more than the executive director positions in a nonprofit. So there's a disconnect when a student says, why is the nonprofit world paying $16 an hour when I can do a government placement? So again, we need to take a look at where that's going. But I would say longitudinally, finding organizations that use students in a very integrated, meaningful way longitudinally, very often they are human and social service organizations.
Okay, thank you. And so we have about 17 minutes and a few, so I just wanted to draw your attention in the chat box. There's somebody mentioned, Nicole writes that there's a special issue in the Engaged Scholar Journal, and one of the articles really pertains to this conversation. So just mention that in the lower right-hand box. And some questions earlier, we talked about time. CFICE, which is the acronym, which is the organization who's putting on this webinar, the SHRP funded project also that Stephen referred to. So it stands for Community First Impacts for Community Engagement. And Lisa, you talked about this idea of how can we support longitudinal, how can we do work together that's longitudinal when, courses are usually running for 14 weeks, the number of hours are so limited. And Anna Predznovek, sorry, I'm probably mispronouncing your name, writes everybody, and this is how do we better support a learning-focused environment in community placements while putting community needs first? I.e., community partners are sometimes assume that students know things which students do not. So also, I want to invite, after this, I would like to invite you to, so Anna, if there's anything else you want to say about that question, maybe we can unmute you. And maybe we'll get Stephen. Do you have?
I have something I'd like to say about that. Okay. I think Lisa is in a better position to comment on it. But I guess just to follow on about the funding issue for students, I think one of the things we need to also be very aware of is that community-based organizations who work with students and whether it's as volunteers or as community-based researchers, they need resources to do that. And so the granting councils, the funding mechanisms that we have, there's ways to get money for the student sometimes through the kind of partnerships that Lisa mentioned. Maybe it's through MyTax or to fund a student to do some summer work or some kind of project. The co-op placement, the youth funding programs the government has. But there's a burden on the community-based organizations for having students in there, for this learning. And so I think we need to be very aware that there has to be some kind of funding mechanism that actually supports community-based organizations the same way that universities and colleges are supported for this learning. So we can't place the burden on them without thinking about that funding. And SHRP is the SHRP funded project from CFICE. One of the things that we learned was that funds had to flow to community-based organizations if they were going to support students.
Lisa, and SHRC, by the way, is SSHRC, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Canada, and it funds research projects, university research projects throughout the country. Okay, Lisa. And actually, you stole the question out of my mouth in terms of what are the systemic and structural changes needed to better support this work. So thank you. Lisa?
You've planted the funding question for me now. There there are organizations that are really good at planning forward and including student-based volunteers in their organizations. We recently did a little bit of a calculation here in Victoria, and we figured our out-of-pocket and actual cash cost of a student, of onboarding a student, it is just over $1,000. You say, well, what is, where is the best benefit? We would always say, well, the best benefit is always in a volunteer or a student or an adult learner, where they can create value, more value. If we're going to sink that cost, it has to be in more than just volunteerism. It has to be in generating knowledge, in creating a product, or freeing up professional staff to do something else that generates more grant money. So I think one of the things that we don't talk a lot about is the in-kind value of this type of work. So I think one of the things that we can do is for every organization and university to say, actually, this is the value of community engaged learning. This is the cost, the out-of-pocket, the sunk, the real cost, but also this is the financial value that it has, and talk more about it. Because I think Stephen's right, it's been hidden for a long time that there's a cost to this, whether it's an opportunity cost or a financial cost.
Thank you. I'll permit, I said I wouldn't jump in, but I'll permit myself just to say this. One of the projects that we're working on right now is to actually assess the benefits and costs of community engaged learning courses from the point of view of students, community partners, staff, and faculty as well, to try to get a really four-dimensional view of the cost from all the different stakeholders involved. So yeah, this is a big issue. And Anna, sorry, I just want to raise, so you've all, by the way, been given permission to mute and unmute yourself, but Anna asks a follow-up question. How do we better support and prepare community partners to host students? Not all have supported students before. We offer training, but they are so busy they cannot always attend the trainings. So I know you were mentioning earlier, Lisa, that you've estimated it's about $1,000. It takes a good chunk of hours to do the training. What would you have to say to sort of the trainings that we can offer to community partners who may not have such trainings in place or have less capacity to do that? Maybe other modules, I don't know. the other version of Stephen's module.
Yeah. So there's an irony in universities that there's so much richness, and there's such a willingness to design powerful learning opportunities that it's confusing. Here at UVic, they sort of mapped 48 or 50 different types of community engaged learning. So when a faculty or a university or a student, faculty member or student calls and says, I'd like a placement, we don't actually know what that means. And if you've ever tried to call someone at a university when you're not in the university, it's actually quite difficult. It sounds very simple. So I think one of those areas of really defining things very clearly. What are we asking for? I'm a huge advocate for a memorandum of understanding. So even a faculty member asking something very simple is having it so that you can email it to people with the original request. This is what we're really asking for. Don't ask for a meeting, don't bring people to training, don't ask them to use their time to figure out what they can't do. Give them as much access to resources in advance so that they can self-select. The other learning, which is a bit ironic, is that it's really difficult for community members to get to campus and park while classes are on. Very often, you sort of think, oh, so sometimes it is easier for campus to come to community than other ways, or to do electronic meetings or phone calls. But very often training on campuses is really difficult. And again, it's very pedestrian to say it's hard to find parking, or I don't know where the building is, or I spent an hour and a half getting to a 20-minute meeting where you didn't actually need me. Valuing that type of time is interesting. So how do we get more community members to engage with universities? Most universities actually don't have a very obvious "this is for community" page on their website, right? This is how you start. If you're not a student, you're not a faculty member, and you're not going into the intranet, what does community need to know about campus, and where would we find that information? Again, it sounds very pedestrian, but those
Not
types
at
of
all.
things
Not at
are.
all. I think a lot of us are nodding because we're being there, done that, makes totally resonating with everything you've just said. So thank you so much. Wondering about,
Isabel, can I just
oh yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I was
add in one thing too, because I agree with everything that Lisa said. That's just, you know, from the seemingly mundane challenges of finding parking to valuing people's time. One of the things I think the universities and the institutions can do is to support that kind of the broker model that we've been experimenting with for the last 20 years at Trent, where there is a community-based broker that basically buffers the community relationship. So they can go to ULinks and say, we're really interested in someone who might do this, do that, and ULinks then thinks about how to interact with the university and find the faculty member or find the student, and helps navigate that, so that then the community partner, it's really a way to facilitate that kind of partnership. But the value of the broker is important, because the same on the other side, the faculty member doesn't necessarily know what the community's needs are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for mentioning that. We actually have a CCP, so essentially we're a whole unit to do just that, essentially boundary brokers between faculty, community partners, student, all that. So I agree that there's often some confusion. It helps to perhaps some of translators and boundary workers. A lot of us here, I think, probably are in those roles who are attending this very workshop. Just wanted to there were a few acronyms and terms used in around work integrated learning. This workshop was titled experiential learning. We also talked about community engaged learning. So I can kind of see Lisa's point about, you know, what does a placement mean? And will, CL, EL, all these sorts of things. So do we think, do both of you see a difference between work integrated learning or community engaged learning, or are all these the same? So what would be your understanding? What are the similarities and differences? You mentioned, Stephen, earlier, there's some kind of dispositions and qualities and competencies that cut across both, but maybe what would be unique to each, or in your mind, your experience? Maybe I'll start with you, Stephen, and then go with Lisa.
There's lots of work. You know, I focused on community-based research because that's where we're at here. We do have some service learning, certainly, but so what we call service learning, and you could think of as volunteerism. Usually the service learning has some kind of reflective component within it. So I think there's a continuum. There's a whole typology that's been developed certainly within the province of Ontario around these types of things, and what is the difference between a co-op placement and an internship, and every institution is going to have some similar attributes and some similar things, but then differences. So it is important. They're different experiences. A co-op, to me, feels like a placement at a corporation or a government, whereas a community-based research feels like it's something that's with a community-based organization. They have a lot of similarities to them, but they are functionally different. I'm not really answering your question. I'm just rambling on now. So I'll turn it over to Lisa.
No, what about you, Lisa? Do you understand these differently?
Yes, and I think the irony of being an organization where we are connected to multiple organizations and multiple faculties is that, again, the difference between an internship and a practicum is what? Right? You're sort of like, oh, actually, this isn't the world that we live in. So I do need you to be actually specific, because if I'm going to deliver the best for a student, I need to know whether or not it's 35 hours, 40 hours, or 100 hours. And I need it to be very clear. And again, if you ask a community organization to spend that time figuring it out, I guarantee they won't. They won't. Those are the annoying things that stop you from doing something again. The other thing I think that we've seen, and it happens less, is students who are desperate for placements. I will not graduate. I will not be able to complete my degree. I need to do something. Please help. And nonprofits are really good. When someone says, I need help, they step in. But the quality of that engagement, the footprint that's left, is hard. So it takes a lot more planning. The busiest time in a nonprofit organization may be any month, but it's traditionally in the fall. So when a faculty member has planned a course and says, well, I'm going to contact an organization in August for preparation for September, we're going to come back and say, you mean next year's September, not this year's September, right? I would say for every course, triple that amount of time and spend 2/3 of it in planning and connections and building networks, as opposed to the matching of students. But I do think there's a place to spend more time talking about how do we place the best students in the best locations, and what types of support do they need? Is it an environment that is fast moving and all go, go, go and all business? Or is it an environment that will nurture and mentor a student at a pace that suits the student's needs? We don't have those conversations generally in advance. We tend to place a student sight unseen or with just a resume. And then we deal with the behavioral support issues as a consequence, rather than as a conversation of building the best placement.
That's a really good thing you've left us with, consequences as opposed to conversation, and some of that kind of math that you've shared around the timing required and what to emphasize is really, excellent takeaways. We're getting close to time, so I'm just going to wrap up, and I want to leave a question for everybody here in the webinar. And it's, how can we start weaving together the ties between nonprofit, student, and university needs with respect to preparing all partners for more meaningful community campus engagement placements? And how do we ensure we keep social justice and community benefit at the heart of our community campus engagement placements, particularly in the light of increasing demands from all sides for these placements, and ensure that they're accessible to students, so we're not reinforcing what Stephen was mentioning earlier about the students who have more privilege and power, having greater access to these opportunities. So I'd just like to thank our presenters very much, Lisa and Stephen. Wonderful presentations, our attendees, very active engagement in the webinar. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. I tried to follow the chat box as best I could. You will receive a link to the webinar video within the next day or two. I encourage you to sign up for the CFICE newsletter, which you will be able to be notified of new resources and events like we had today. And so I will leave you to wherever you are, whether it's lunchtime, breakfast, afternoon. We're a wide group here from all across Canada. Thank you again for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Stephen.
Yes. Thanks, Isabel. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks to everyone else.